Everything old is new again. America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, bark like a dog for me.
Where's the goodies? Leave the gun. Technique and only.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I don't want no volunteers. I don't want no mates. There's too many captains on this island. $10,000 for me by myself. For that you get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Welcome to Everything Old is New Again. This is Douglas Viviani with the rather blockbuster David Cohen.
Summer blockbuster.
There you go. Why can you, you tell me, recognize those quotes and where we're coming from?
Sure, those are from the infamous movie Jaws.
Of course, it changed all swimming at the beach for all of us in 1975. Classic movie up there with the best of them for me. And set the tone for summer. I mean, if you really think about it, it was the first of what we now call the summer blockbuster movies. And I would suggest certainly one of the best movies of all time, no?
It's definitely up there.
Yeah.
One of the best thriller adventure movies, sure.
Go. And this week we've got the pleasure of welcoming American screenwriter, actor, comedian, executive Carl Gottlieb to Everything Old is New Again. He's probably best known for co-writing the screenplay to Jaws and its first two sequels. Also, you may not recognize this, but this is going to be great to discuss. He certainly did co-write The Jerk with Steve Martin. He directed the 81 comedy film Caveman with Ringo Starr. We love the Beatles. We may ask a question or two about that. What do you think, Dave? Anything else?
Yeah, he also started writing comedy for TV. He contributed to the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, which he won an Emmy for. He also wrote for the Bob Newhart Show, All in the Family, and The Odd Couple.
And had acting roles, believe it or not, in MASH, the movie, and the film Clueless. So, of course, he was Harry Meadows, the editor of the local newspaper in Jaws, if you remember that. Anyway, welcome, Carl Gottlieb.
Hello.
It's great to hear from you. Great to speak with you. After that introduction, we have about 3-4 minutes left to our hour show. But
I'm old, but I feel new again.
There you go. Perfect. In writing the screenplay for this Peter Benchley book, you made changes, and I think that they are largely accepted as great changes for the screen. Could you give us a little bit of the inside as to kind of what we would have seen had those changes not been made, or a better way to say it is, what changes did you make to the original work?
Well, what we did was in the movie was basically cut away all the underbrush, all the subplots, and a lot of sidebar material that worked for the novel, because in a novel you have infinite time. The reader can always put it down if they get bored.
Right.
In a movie, you can't take a moment, you can't bore the audience, so you got to keep it moving and concentrate on the story. So we cut out. There was a subplot about the mayor being in debt to the mafia for a real estate development on the beach, and more importantly, there was a love triangle in which Ellen Brody, played by Lorraine Gary, has an affair with Hooper, the oceanographer, played by Dreyfuss. And that seemed so improbable, especially once we saw the actors on the set and realized there was no way you were going to buy that kind of infidelity from those people. They were too nice. Right. So we cut that, and we were left with the core of the story, which is 3 men, a boat, and a fish.
There you go. And did Peter Benchley, who wrote the book, he was on. I understand he was on set a little bit there, and in some ways was not exactly happy the entire time. Certainly loved the result, but did you hear from him during the process?
Well, early on, he gave an interview or two where he was probably a little dismissive of Stephen, saying that he was more of a gadget director, and and then Stephen gave an interview that the novel was a trashy summer read, and he was going to try to make a good movie out of it. But but those were in print. Once Peter came to location to do his part, where he played a television newscaster, And once he came to the vineyard and stayed for a few days and saw what we were struggling with and how the picture was going and the difficulties we faced, he realized that everybody was actually trying to do him a service by making a good movie out of this good book. And we became friendly, actually, by the end of his stay. He had done the first draft of the screenplay. That's why his name's on it.
Right.
But it was largely rewritten by an uncredited writer named Howard Sackler, who I'm always happy to mention. And then my rewrite was the last one.
There you go. And you spoke about some of the difficulties with the filming. We know, if you study this a little bit, you know, there was supposed to be a 2-month shoot, and it turned out to be 7 months. And some of the reason was this mechanical shark did not work. Were there some scenes that you wrote or that was in the screenplay for the shark? I presume there were that we didn't yet or didn't see because of the problems, and you had to rewrite in a different way, right?
Yeah, well, what happened was we knew. I mean, when I got to the vineyard with Stephen, it was like 2 weeks before we started shooting, and we knew there were problems with the shark. So we were planning early not to write any new stuff for the shark. It's like when you get to the set and you realize the actor is sick, you don't give him 10 more pages of dialogue. You try to make it easier on him or her. So same with the shark. We realized the shark was sick and couldn't work every day like a normal mechanical shark
right.
that had never been built before to that scale.
Right.
So we immediately started to figure out how can we work around the shark. And I think it was a pretty elegant solution. Steve and I were both familiar with a movie called The Thing that John Carpenter remade. It was a black and white horror movie from the 50s in which you don't see the villain, a creature from outer space, until quite late. And we said, hey, we can do that. We can hold back on actually seeing the shark until it's absolutely necessary and keep the audience in suspense. And at the same time, we can show the horrible effects of the shark with, Chrissy's death in the opening reel of the film, which is one of the great movie deaths of all time, and you never see the shark.
Right, and that was, you say John Carpenter, and he did a tremendous job with that movie, of course. I would hearken back a little bit more to, just from a novice point of view, not knowing anything, but just saying that kind of Hitchcockian in a way, also because the nemesis was omnipresent and referred to musically and lurking around, but you didn't see this shark until, halfway through the movie. And I know, as you said, it's not necessarily by design, but at some point, it seemed to be, it added, like we hear a lot of in art forms, the difficult times, the obstacles placed in your path, in some ways lead to a better result, like using those barrels to show that the shark is near. Were the barrels, for example, something you added later, or was that in the original setup?
Oh, that was we always had the barrels, but we realized when we couldn't show the shark in close proximity to the boat a lot of times, that was a very difficult shot to make under the best of circumstances. So we said, all right, well, the barrels tell us they're hooked. We know the barrels are hooked to the shark, and if the barrels are in the shot, then the shark is in the shot, even though he's not visible. He's underwater, but he's there. So by having the barrels and then the bumping of the boat at night and all the extra shark stuff, even though the shark wasn't on the screen, you got the feeling that he was. The danger was always there.
Yeah, it was lurking around and ready to make an appearance at any time. And we're enjoying a discussion with the co-screenwriter, or the screenwriter really, Carl Gottlieb of Jaws. We'll be back on Everything Old is New Again to switch gears a little bit and talk about the classic comedians that you've been working with. We'll be right back right after this.
To you, fair
Everything Old is New Again.
Ladies. Farewell and adieu.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
From Television City in Hollywood, ladies and gentlemen, the Smothers Brothers.
Of course, when you think of Jaws, naturally you think of the Smothers Brothers, and this is Everything Old is New Again. We're transitioning here, talking to Carl Gottlieb, the screenwriter of Jaws, but gentlemen, that was also involved with quite a number of shows from the 60s and 70s that you may not be aware of. David Cohen, are you familiar with the Smothers Brothers?
Of course.
And
sure.
Who else was a writer on Smothers Brothers, if you're familiar?
We had a great class that year. That was they were looking for new writers. Their show had been on the air for a couple of years, and they kind of inherited the producing job, so it was like their show. They could do anything they wanted. So they hired a bunch of young guys, myself, Rob Reiner, Steve Martin, songwriter, singer named John Hartford, Albert Einstein, who's not Albert, Bob Einstein, who's Albert Brooks's brother,
right,
and a character in his own right. A Canadian writer named Paul Wayne, McLean Stevenson was briefly on staff. It was a lot of young, funny people.
That's great. And Carl, you said Carl Reiner, right? Not Rob Reiner.
Rob.
Rob Reiner. Okay, and Carl Reiner later on you work with on The Jerk. We'll kind of billboard that for our third section we will talk about. But that's amazing. And then out of that group, you were presented with and won the Emmy for writing for the Smothers Brothers in '69. And I think that's an amazing accomplishment on a show like that had such significance back in the day. We need to place us back in that day what they were like. But before we do that, I mean, did they have you contribute to them with the skits, with their stand-up, a combination of that, or what were you participating with in terms of writing for that show?
Well, I was partnered with another writer who was a young writer who had been with them for a season or two, named Lorenzo Music. Now, Lorenzo is the guy who created the first Bob Newhart show and Rhoda and a lot of other great television. And Lorenzo and I we wrote a lot of their opening monologues, and then we also wrote a lot of big sketches. The show that won the Emmy was the show that Lorenzo and I were co-head writers of. That was with I think David Fry was the guest on that show. We did political satire.
And speaking of that, that's what the Smothers Brothers did a lot of for 3 years, was topical political satire, opinionated, which in the 60s was starting to come about, and people weren't so used to that. And that,
no, they weren't. And when we were doing political material, it was quite a job to get it past the network and get it on the air.
Exactly. And then there was a guest on at one point, George Harrison, who was a Beatle and a friend of ours, and a foreshadowing of some questions we may have down the line. But let's just hear 2 seconds of George Harrison on the show referencing what we're talking about here.
Do you have something important?
Something very important to say on American television.
You know, a lot of times we don't have opportunity to say anything important because it's American television. Every time you say something, they try to say something important,
well, whether you can say it or not, keep trying to say it.
That's what's important.
You get that? Yeah. That is very important.
Not the most eloquent man in the world, but at the time he was one of the biggest bands in the world, and made an appearance on Smothers Brothers. I don't know the timing. Was that when you were on the show before?
Yes, that was a show. That was a show that not only was I a writer on that show, I performed on that show.
Oh, there you go. So you put the words into George Harrison's mouth, then. Let's put it that way.
Well, no, I think George can speak for himself.
But he was alluding to, and they all were alluding to, as we just spoke about, the political discussion, the problems with the censors, I guess you'd say, and some of the issues were happening there. What was the eventual demise of that show? Was it, I think we could say, in the censor's point of view, going a little bit too far, or what was happening there at the end?
At the end, they thought we were going too far, and there was a lot of personal animosity between Tommy and one of the presidents at CBS. They didn't get along at all, and when they canceled the show, they picked some contractual fine print violation to call us on. But in the meantime, they had deeply censored a show with Joan Baez. They were very unhappy with a very funny religious sketch that David Steinberg performed. They were unhappy with a presentation of a musical number by Harry Belafonte called Don't Stop the Carnival, in which we used a lot of background footage of the Chicago riots in '68 during the Democratic Convention. We were a very political show, and we talked about it all the time. The network hated it, and it was a constant struggle, and then it just finally, the network finally lost patience and said, you know what, you're out of here. And that was the end of the show.
Yeah, kind of sad because we lost I don't know, quite a gem there. If you go back and look, even at their skits and of course the stand up, it still holds up to this day. It's hard to find. You got to go to YouTube or what have you, but it's well worth a view. Once you left that show, you did many other things, but one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit was Flip Wilson, and because you work with so many talented artists and comedians. Let's hear a smidge to remember what Flip Wilson was all about with Bing Crosby and Geraldine.
You gotta see it to believe it.
Well, you better believe it, because you ain't gonna get to see it.
I don't know why you call this thing a drink. It tastes like sarsaparilla. It really does.
Don't touch me! Don't touch me! You got a lot of nerve, honey. Don't put your hands on me. You don't know me. Don't come in here touching me. Just because I'm dressed like this doesn't mean I'm a loose woman.
There you go, and it just brings back a memory if you haven't heard or seen Flip Wilson before. Back in the day, this gentleman was, with the Smothers Brothers, what would you say, top 5, top 10 comedians for sure, but maybe even people on television for quite a while, no?
That's true. He was a huge star.
And a real breakthrough for television, where he just came on and poor sets, if you will, sort of did it in a round. So the skits, they didn't need many props and all that, and they didn't get crazy with all that. It was the substance of what was going on, and you could see the audience, and so they were performing the show. So what was it like to write for and for Flip Wilson versus Smothers Brothers? What kind of freedom do they give you? Are there certain limitations that the different artists give you, or they just give you free hand?
Well, they give you a free hand, but you, as a writer, you have to be sensitive to what it is they do. I mean, I would not write a kind of a snappy back and forth banter for Flip Wilson and a guest, on a political subject. But I would do, I could write something for Geraldine certainly. And the shows that I worked on with Flip were 4 specials that he did for NBC, and the very first one was produced by Lorne Michaels just before he went on to do Saturday Night Live. And Flip's guests on that show that I got to write for were Richard Pryor, Lily Tomlin, and Peter Sellers, if you can imagine.
Right. And what is the common denominator, real quick, if I have like 30 seconds here, with all of these talented individuals? Comedy is serious business, no?
Absolutely. Even though you got to know where the laughs are, you have to trust where the laughs are. You're never sure. And a lot depends on the performer's delivery. So 100,000 variables go into every second of performance, and you have to be kind of aware of that stuff. And when you're writing it, you have to create it so that the performer could trust the material to get the laughs.
Certainly, and what you're saying also is you need to know the voice. Each of these individuals have a certain characteristic to their presentation and what they talk about, right? And you need to know what they're all about.
Yeah, you need to write what they can do, and sometimes you have to make them stretch a little bit. In the sketch we did with Flip and Lily Tomlin, she was doing one of her characters, and Flip was doing a new character for him. He was playing a fairly straight part of a young man who misses his mother and is making a recording to send to her, and it was a bit of a stretch, but Flip performed it, and as a result was a great straight man for both Lily Tomlin and Richard Pryor, who were in the sketch with him.
And we're enjoying a conversation with a gentleman that's a quite talented writer himself and performer. Carl Gottlieb will be back on Everything Old is New Again. Turn to the Jerk and Steve Martin and have some fun talking about that. We'll be right back right after this.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything Old is New Again with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I need this or this. This ashtray. This paddle game. The ashtray and the paddle game, that's all I need. again? Remote control. The ashtray, the power game, and the remote control. That's all I need. These matches.
Welcome back to Everything Old is New again. We're talking with Carl Gottlieb, co-writer of, in this particular case, of The Jerk. David Cohen, do you remember when that movie came out?
Oh, of course.
And
huge.
We quoted that little soliloquy went on and on and on,
right?
And it's still memorable to this day, I have to say. And we had some fun. That kind of developed, or was a mirror to our, I guess you'd say, personality comedy back in the day. No?
Yeah, Steve Martin was heavily influential on me, and I think on you as well.
Yeah, he really was. Let's go back to some of the smidge of beginning where, believe it or not, Steve Martin was on Smothers Brothers, made a little bit of an appearance. Before we dive into this with Mr. Gottlieb, I just want to remind us all a little smidge of where Steve's came
We happened to be walking through the writer area of the show, and there he was sitting at one of our writers' desks. And later we found out that he actually was one of our writers. It's amazing. Yeah, and since he hasn't been paid for his work, we thought we'd let him come out and tonight and make a few dollars. That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Martin.
There we go. So just that's the introduction. He does a bad magic routine after that. And Carl, do you remember that? Were you on the show at the time? I'm not familiar with the exact timing of that.
I'm pretty sure I was on the show then. Steve used to do magic in his act and play banjo. Everything he does today, but then it was kind of new, and he would say on stage, I remember, by now you're probably saying to yourself, this is just another comedy magic banjo act.
Exactly. Well, he took this, let's get out of context there, in like 78, 79, 10 years later, he was playing the Nassau Coliseum by us and all these other venue. Matter of fact, the first concert, in quotes, concert I ever went to was a packed Nassau Coliseum with 15,000 people to see a comedian. I think that was one of the first times I ever heard of that happening.
Steve was the first comedian to play stadiums. That's true.
Yeah. So what was it like before all of that? Of course, after you did this tremendous work with the Smothers Brothers, or while you were doing that tremendous work and beginning your career, he's beginning his, I guess we'd say. Were you teamed up with him ever, or did you just sort of across the room with him in the writer's room?
Oh, we wrote stuff together. All the one of the ways a writer's room works in comedy and television is that the whole writing staff is basically in the room, pitching jokes, trying to punch up material. Maybe one or two writers have written a sketch or a monologue, and then everybody piles on and tries to add to it or make it better. So it's a very active process, and Steve was part of the room and was terrific.
See that? I can imagine that room again with Carl Reiner and all the people you mentioned previously. Had that Smothers Brothers continued, I'm sure we would have seen some more classic material from that group if you could have kept them together. And thereafter, apparently, I don't know the story behind the scenes, but it's pretty obvious that Steve and Carl Reiner were getting together with you to write The Jerk, and Carl Reiner directed it. So how did that develop? Did he ask you? You asked him? What was happening there?
We had finished the show. The show was canceled. Steve was his solo career was accelerating. He was starting to play big rooms. Paramount Studios had a president named David Picker, who was a fan of Steve's and believed that he could be a movie star. So he signed Steve to a 2-picture deal at Paramount, and he could write the scripts for himself to star in. And at that point, Steve talked to me and said, "Would you? I've never written a movie. You've written a couple. You've written a couple of movies. I had already written Jaws, and I had also written a Richard Pryor comedy called Which Way Is Up." So I had my comedy credentials in order. I had my screenwriting credentials in order. I was acceptable to the studio. So we were hired as collaborators to write the screenplay. And the screenplay turned out to be the first draft of The Jerk.
See that, and unlike I think Jaws, which it appears we've talked about, you had to rewrite over and over again, or at least modify based upon the problems and difficulties on set. It seems like how is it working on The Jerk? Was it pretty A plus B equals C, or did you have to rewrite on the run as well?
Well, we didn't rewrite On the Run, but what happened was Paramount had one of those weird management shifts where two new guys were brought in to run the studio. It was Barry Diller and Michael Eisner, who had been very successful at ABC Television, and they came in and they didn't like or trust David Picker's choices, and they didn't have any confidence in Steve, so they canceled his project. So at the same time, Steve decided to move to another studio, so the project went to Universal, and a friend of mine, a comedy writer named Michael Elias, who had a lot of success in television, Michael went to work on the rewrite and did a terrific job and changed the shape of the movie. And at the same time, Carl Reiner came on board, and he's no writing slouch. He knows how to get a laugh. So Carl Reiner and Michael Elias and Steve collaborated on what was going to be The Jerk. The screenplay credit is story by Carl Gottlieb and Steve Martin, and screenplay by Steve Martin, Carl Gottlieb, and Michael Elias. So there were, three of us actively involved in making that movie. I stepped out because I had other stuff to do, but they went on to make the movie.
See that, and a classic. It was just a smidge to bring it to mind here. A little, just a piece of the restaurant scene here, just to bring us to life.
Monsieur care for another bottle of the Chateau Latour?
Yes, but no more 1966. Let's splurge. Bring us some fresh wine, the freshest you've got. This year's. No more of this old stuff.
Oui, monsieur.
He doesn't realize he's dealing with sophisticated people here.
There you go. So certainly that character had a voice. We were talking about previously, all of his own. Do you, in the writer's room of this, or any of these where you're trying to, you wrote for so many classic comedians, do you write down, like Geraldine or this character, like characteristics of the character so you keep it in mind? Or is there any kind of, is it just, a freewheeling kind of a thing in your mind, keep in mind what you're going for? How do you organize this fictional person and remember and know what their characteristics are like?
Well, you got to remember that the fictional person is actually real because it's embodied in a human being who is performing. So you become familiar with that performer just as you would become familiar with a friend. I know Steve Martin as a guy, and I know Steve Martin as Navin Johnson. So when I'm writing on The Jerk, I'm writing for Navin, not for Steve. It's and same thing. Flip Wilson, is a serious comedian, and he comes in and he's serious about the work, and he's, wants to know where the laughs are. But at the same time, in your mind, you're not thinking of this guy who's in the room, who's executive producer and owns the show. You're thinking of this guy who goes on stage, either in a dress or a tight suit, and he has a performance voice, and that's what you write for. You write for the performer voice.
But there's no outline or something where the performer or somebody says these are the characteristics of this character. They expect you to know it. You've got to do your homework ahead of time, I presume.
Yes, yeah. You wouldn't be in the room if you hadn't demonstrated some ability to identify with the character and talk in that character's voice.
And voices you spoke about, we've talked about, but you've also, we're out of time here for this section. We'll carry this over. Dan Aykroyd and Robin Williams and George Burns. So you're quite the experience there and a lot of variety. So we're happy to have some fun and talk with Carl Gottlieb on Everything Old is New Again. We'll be right back right after this. Continue with Everything Old is New Again.
This is Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Hey, it's Dr. Peter Weller. I'm here with my friends David Cohen and Douglas Viviani on Everything Old is New Again. It's one of my favorite shows, and I may not be the most interesting man in the world, but I'm one of them.
There we are, and this is yet another interesting man, Carl Gottlieb. We're having some fun with on Everything Old is New Again. I want to investigate a little bit of the future of comedy, maybe the legacy of Jaws, and to talk about hits and misses and the Beatles themselves. We spoke about George Harrison, who was on the Smothers Brothers. You directed and wrote Caveman, a movie starring another Beatle, Ringo Starr. Take us there. I mean, he was a Beatle. What was he like to work with? Any stories from the set? They just seem to be mysterious to us still to this day.
Well, Ringo was a Beatle, but he also liked to act. He liked being, identified as an all-round performer, and he did whatever he could to do that. He worked in the films besides ours, but it was a starring role, and it was an interesting, funny picture. There was no dialogue per se. They spoke in caveman talk, and there was a lot of visual humor. And Ringo's a very funny guy. If you remember Hard Day's Night, he's one of the most charming guys in that film because of his deadpan humor. And we needed a guy who was kind of, not imposing, a slight figure. And there weren't many leading men who were kind of, nebbishes. And Ringo was happy to be the leading man who was something of a nebbish who, acquires stature during the film, during the story.
And am I wrong? I'm just remembering this as we think about it. Did he meet his wife on that set?
Yep, I've been present for a lot of off-screen romances. I mean, Ringo and Barbara Bach hooked up on that show and have been together ever since. And when I did Dr. Detroit with Dan Aykroyd, that's where he met Donna Dixon and married her.
How about that?
So, I mean, if you're in a movie with me, you might get to marry your leading lady.
Yeah, you're a lucky charm. And speaking of leading men and leading ladies, whatever, in comedy, when I think about comedy teams, I think of course, Abbott Costello, to Martin and Lewis, to the Smothers Brothers, and a few in between. But then the question is, right now, we've done a couple of shows about this. I don't necessarily know that it's alive and well, the comedy team. Do you agree? And basically the question is there a future for comedy teams, for someone that's written for one classic team and is contemporary at this point?
Well, I would direct your and your audience's attention to Key and Peele, who are a comedy team, who are very, very funny, who had their own show on, I think, one of the premium cable channels. Keegan-Michael Key and I forget Peele's first name.
Right.
He's just directed something. I think they've split up or are working separately now, but they were a very successful team and very outspoken and well-known. I mean, Key did Obama's last White House press dinner as a comedian.
Right, and
you're right. There's not a lot of teams, unless if you count, like the cast of Saturday Night Live or the way that Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart work together, and the way that a lot of the Trevor Noah and there are Amy Schumer, of course.
Right.
There are comedians who work and play well with others, and we get to benefit from that association. It's not a permanent association. There isn't a vaudeville stage where they can go and polish their material anymore. So you don't see the teams the way they used to exist. But you do see ensemble comedy, which is in a way very, just as satisfying, because you're seeing very funny people interacting and capturing your attention.
Yes, and then you see people like, The Rock, who's never really done comedy with, Kevin Hart in that latest movie, and hugely successful. But it's interesting that art of, and I guess it's like you said, because of vaudeville, the art of perfecting this craft for years before you hit the screen and are a legitimate, quote, team together, is probably something that we're not going to see very often. And like you say, though, there are teams like these, like sitcom teams, like Seinfeld is a team of 4. I mean, they were on for 9 years, and you got to consider them a team, if you will, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the great ensemble shows, going all the way back to I Love Lucy and the Dick Van Dyke Show, television situation comedy over the decades has given us some great teams and some great ensembles whether it's Seinfeld or Friends or Ray Romano's Family or Amy Schumer and Amy Poehler when she did the Parks and Recreation.
Right.
You get and of course the team that does Big Bang Theory. I mean, they're huge and they work beautifully together. So the form is not dead. I mean, we're seeing ensemble comedy all around us all the time, and it's just an example of how a cooperative effort can produce a whole that's more than the sum of its parts.
Right. It's more than or it's morphed, I should say, than from two gentlemen on stage bantering back and forth into what we just spoke about for the maybe for the better, at least for more variety. Let's put it that way. And then let's turn a little bit to Jaws again. And I just want to say and see if you have any thoughts about the legacy of what you did with Jaws. It's something that's on almost before every summer. People get in the mood for summer with Jaws, and we water skiing or swimming at the beach. There's always inevitably someone is doing the theme every so often. And I don't know. Do you feel that there's a legacy that Jaws has left, and did it teach us anything about movie making and horror, anything of that nature?
Well, yeah, I wrote a book about it, which I should mention here because my publisher will be happy. It's called The Jaws Log. It's available wherever books are sold.
Good.
It's by Carl Gottlieb. It's a history of the movie and tells all about it. So for a lot of the detailed responses, look in The Jaws Log by Carl Gottlieb. But more importantly, when nobody knew it was going to be an iconic film when we made it. Everybody was just trying to do the best job they could, and for whatever accident of genius filmmaking and marketing and distribution and hitting the culture at the right time at the right place, it became an iconic film. So now we're faced with a reality in which at any given moment it's Shark Week somewhere on the planet. Right. I can't escape the fish, and for 41 years people have come up to me, and if they know that I wrote the movie, the first thing they say is, after I saw that movie, I didn't go in the water, or I didn't take a bath, or I didn't go in a swimming pool, or I didn't jump in a stream. They have this kind of irrational fear of sharks, and I guess that's a legacy. Peter Benchley was sorry that he ever did that and devoted the last half of his life to conservation and shark preservation.
Right. Well, I'll tell you that brings us to full circle to everything old is new again, and how we celebrate the past with an eye towards the future, and we like to show how different genres of entertainment, pop culture are popular today, and certainly based upon works of the past. Do you agree with that theory that even what we're talking about writing comedy and so forth, that there are evolution of comedy, evolution of horror, but it is somewhat based upon the works and classic of the past, no?
Oh, everything you see today, whether it's the most cutting-edge monologue on cable television with lots of swear words, it all has its roots in things that happened before. I once was interested in the history of comedy on television, and every genre of show that's on television today was on the schedule the very first network season in 1949. There was a family comedy, there was a late-night talk show, there was there were genres that are gone now, like westerns.
Right.
Used to be westerns on television, but everything on television has an ancestor that was on television before that, and in many cases on radio.
Right, and that's what we're trying to, not to talk about us too much, but the idea is that there could be more done with radio. We can have some fun. It's time to have some fun. Politics and sports and medicine and financial are all fine to talk about, but we're happy to bring some fun, or try to bring some fun to the radio, talking about pop culture entertainment, and we're happy to do so with Carl Gottlieb.
I've just got to add that if you've got any stature in show business in the world today, it's because you're standing on the shoulders of people who have gone before you.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And we're thankful for your input and help. And do take a look at the Jaws log. You can definitely get it on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. Check those out. The Jaws log. Take a look behind the scenes. There's a lot of more behind the scenes than we just spoke about, and some discussion of the themes of Jaws and so forth, and the thoughts of Carl Gottlieb, the screenwriter of the Jerk, and so many other projects. We're so happy to have had you. Thank you, Mr. Gottlieb, for taking the time to be with us on Everything Old is New Again.
That's because I'm old and you're new again.
There you go. Come full circle. We're looking forward to being in your position someday with an Emmy and all the credits that you have. So something to shoot for. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll be back on Everything Old is New Again next week to continue talking entertainment, pop culture. Listen to this. This will keep you alive, keep you awake. Come on back. Everything Old is New Again next week.